In part 1 of our interview with Professor Howard Adelman, we learned that in 1979, sponsorship for refugees of the Vietnam War somehow went viral in Canada, even though it was pre-internet times. Professor Adelman let us know that within just 3 to 4 weeks, 66 chapters of private sponsors sprung up all over the country, organized by landline telephone. Now for part 2 of our interview, I asked Professor Adelman, wasn't there racism and xenophobia in those times? Most refugees would tell you that they are trying to escape terror. But what must Canadians back in 1979 have feared when strangers, maybe even potential terrorists, were coming to their country?
Well, it was racist in that time more than fear of terrorists. What happened in that time is the National Citizens Coalition in August. And the National Citizens Coalition is essentially a right-wing conservative, minimal government, minimal taxes, etc. They started they published a full-page ad in all the newspapers that said, every refugee who comes is going to bring 16 relatives. So, i.e., the yellow peril will soon be an Asian country. We shrugged, who cares? But anyway, it was false because that was the legislation after the Second World War. It was no longer relevant. But the fact is, it would have been very bad for the refugees to come in that kind of xenophobic thing. It would also affect some people in beginning to oppose the new policy. In September, they published full-page ads again, published a survey that they had done with sort of leading questions in which they claimed that a clear majority of Canadians were opposed to bringing 50,000 refugees. Not just a simple majority, a clear majority.
Based on an actual
survey they did across Canada. Whether they asked 2,000 people, I don't really know. But they gave the survey results and said that only 30-something% supported this policy. When I did my first book on the Indo-Chinese refugees, I discovered the government had itself done surveys. And it had found that, in fact, even though those questions were misleading, when it done an honest survey, there were truly, not as much as they said, but there was a majority Canadians opposed. And part of it was clearly racism. If you go, you have to think that in 1967, only 12 years earlier, Canadian immigration policy was a racist policy. It only changed in 1967, and this is only 12 years later. So you had this residual sense in Canada, but in fact, it was easily overcome. We, as far as the National Citizens Coalition, Joseph Wong did it. He had a guy he knew supported the National Citizens Coalition. He's a very rich guy.
Who is Joseph?
Joseph Wong is a doctor and became one of the leaders in the Indo-Chinese. He became the chairman of Operation Lifeline. He became head of United Way. He's done a marvelous number of things. Anyway, Joseph organized a meeting at 7 in the morning with this rich guy, and he and I went down and had breakfast with him. And after we explained the problem in an hour, he said he'll take care of it. He'll phone us back when he's got it done. And he phoned Joseph at noon, and he said, don't worry about it anymore, they won't publish any more ads. He had phoned 17 of his friends. They got the mandate to go and tell Colin Brown, who was running the National Citizens Coalition at the time. Stephen Harper was the head of National Citizens Coalition at one point. Anyway, he got Colin Brown went to see him and said, look, all these 17 people, if you publish another ad on this issue, we'll withdraw our funding support. Further, we'll not only do that, I'll phone my friends across the country to withdraw their support, and you'll be dead as an organization. He didn't publish anything else. There was also a media thing where Doug Collins, who was a journalist, a racist journalist from the West Coast, was saying similar things, and Ron Atke was combating him on radio and TV, and I was, and some other people were. So that battle was fought, but largely won. They were seen as very marginal figures after we ran this campaign. And so though the xenophobia represented a large number of Canadians, it had no real voice. The leadership in every organization, teachers, lawyers, dentists, doctors, you name them, architects, they all came out in support. What can we do to help the refugees? So the leading sectors are all for it, but a majority of Canadians were not. In contrast to then, the xenophobia is somewhat different, and you alluded to it in your question, because they don't talk in a kind of racist term about like Asians or yellow peril or that kind of stuff. It's that there'll be terrorists among the refugees. All the three parties in Canada insisted that there would be proper security checks, etc. There's all kinds of ironies in this. One is, from our scholarship, we know that refugees coming into a country like Canada as a refugee would be the absolutely worst way for a terrorist to get to Canada.
And why is that?
Because he'd be too well documented. There's a process of documenting. If he came as a visitor, just shows a visitor's pass. There's no real file opened up on him. If he came as a graduate student or a student, easy to do, small file, inconsequential. If he came as an investor, there's all kinds of ways to come into Canada, and the refugee route would be the absolute stupidest way. So we don't have any evidence of terrorists using this route to get to Canada. So that says something, that there's paranoia in this rather than things. Further, everybody says there should be security checks. I'll tell you a story though. I interviewed a family of a mother, this is in Calgary, a mother with 3 children, aged 26, 22, and 18. And they told me what the visa officer had asked them, etc. And I asked them, did they ask any of these security questions? And they said no. And I had interviewed them separately, not all together. And then, was there a separate security officer interviewed you? No. So even though everybody said there's security checks, there doesn't seem to be any security checks. Nor would I say it's warranted, because this is a family of Christians who are being persecuted, who are fleeing from Syria to Lebanon. Further, we tend to take those who are most vulnerable, which is a lot of Christians who are being persecuted. We take families as a whole with children. So this paranoia is it's a total red herring. But we'll do the security checks anyway to the extent that they do it. It's not a valid point, which indicates that it's a parallel level of irrationality to the racism back in '67.
Well,
and it seems to have some warrant, because some of those Arabs are absolutely horrible terrorists. So you said justification then. But back then, there was a worry that, especially in 1975, that the Vietnamese government would send over communists among the refugees.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah. And it was a false...
was there any documented cases of Viet Cong?
No, none.
Enemies?
No, we did have cases of second-generation Vietnamese who became killers for Chinese gangs. Because in every refugee movement, you're going to get some bad types. Not everyone, almost everyone. You get some bad types, and that was the case with the Indo-Chinese refugee movement, which embarrasses them to a degree, but you're never going to get, if you take people, they're not always going to be 100% good. It's just a reality. And that was true in virtually all movements. The Hungarian movement, the first big movement in '67, in '56 at the most, because they took a lot of prisoners from jail, and so we had a criminal element there.
But it's never disproportionately more
No,
than a regular population.
Oh, it's usually disproportionately less.
Okay.
Oh, usually disproportionately less. No, and the success rates, I mean, you know yourself from growing up how well the Vietnamese community has done, how well the Chinese community, how well the South Asian community has done in Canada. When you get a second generation immigrant group, they're so pressured by their parents to succeed. You got to become a doctor. You got to become a manager or something.
Oh, geez, I
successful.
feel like an underachiever. Okay.
Did you get that pressure?
Yes, yes, and I resisted it quite a lot.
Right.
So, yeah.
So you end up interviewing me.
Yeah, it's
That's your
like the top
penalty.
of the line. I'm at the top of the mountain.